Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea's central bank lowers its key policy rate by a quarter percentage point. It's now at a record low to boost growth amid weak exports and consumption. South Korea's unemployment rate falls to its lowest in 6 years. Almost 350,000 jobs added in September compared to a year ago, but risks to the recovery remain. And the IMF cuts its forecast for global growth this year again, now at 3% for the world economy, and for South Korea, growth estimated at just 2%. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon Jae-in says the Korean people want a better democracy. He was speaking Wednesday at the first national ceremony to mark the anniversary of the Busan-Masan Democratic Protests, a movement 40 years ago in which Koreans rose up against authoritarianism. Shin Se-min has the details.
President Moon Jae-in said Koreans want to further advance the nation's democracy, saying they want a better democracy.
사람들이 진정으로 나라의 주인이 되는 민주주의, 국가적 성취가 국민의 생활로 완성되는 민주주의를 향해 국민과 함께 나아가겠습니다.
Attending the first national commemorative event marking the 40th anniversary of the Busan-Masan Democratic Protests, one of the key events in the nation's democratic transformation against military rule under Park Chung-hee administration in 1979, the president said no state agency will be able to reign over the people. He added that government institutions exist for the sake of the people, not for the sake of their organizations. Such comments are seen as a way of expressing the president's stern resolve in reforming the nation's prosecution, which has long been criticized for abusing its excessive authority, again reiterating his promise that such reform will continue despite the resignation of the justice minister earlier this week. The president also pointed to the lack of government-level compensation for those who were victimized during the protests and offered his apology for the human rights violations that occurred. The Busan-Masan Democratic Protests, which broke out in the nation's southern cities, were public movements against the dictatorship of the Park Chung-hee regime, and they helped the nation eventually transform into a democracy. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
The two Koreas faced off in a historic World Cup qualifier last night, but nobody was able to watch it because the North didn't allow fans into the stadium and imposed a media blackout. It was a 0-0 draw, but football fans around the world were not pleased about being kept in the dark. Our Won Jung-hwan has more.
The fixture between the two Koreas on Tuesday was surreal, not because of the results or how the game was played, but because it was played in an empty stadium in Pyongyang with no live coverage. The 50,000-seat Kim Il-sung Stadium was virtually empty, except for a few members of the organizing staff, including FIFA President Gianni Infantino. In fact, Infantino, who expected a lot from Tuesday's historic match between the two Koreas, expressed great disappointment. He said in a statement that he was let down to see no fans in the stadium and was surprised by issues regarding live broadcast and problems with access for foreign journalists. But it wasn't just the head of the world's football governing body who voiced their concerns regarding this peculiar match. Many news outlets also expressed disappointment in their coverage of the game. British live coverage website The Football London posted during the game that conditions were ideal for the match except for the lack of fans and media, which it described as a shame. Vietnamese media outlets were also upset over the lack of media coverage, saying the only to receive match updates was through the football governing body's social media accounts. While the backlash over the closed-door match has been strong, some experts came up with a number of theories for the empty stands. Some have pointed out, as was the case in 2005 against Iran, North Korea might have been concerned about the possibility of its national team losing to the South in front of an angry home crowd. Indeed, when North Korea failed to qualify for the World Cup in a match against Iran, fans hurled bottles and cans at referees and the Iranian players. Although many football fans couldn't watch the historic game live, a recorded version of the match will be broadcast by South Korean networks with the tape expected to arrive later tonight. 원정환, 아리랑 뉴스.
In other news, a senior U.S. defense official says Washington's sanctions on North Korea are intended to encourage the regime to engage in dialogue with a mindset aimed at finding solutions. Ji-young has this report.
U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Randall Shriver said U.S. sanctions on North Korea are mostly intended to encourage dialogue in a way that ensures productive discussions. Speaking at the Jamestown Foundation's annual China Defense and Security Conference on Tuesday, Shriver stressed the importance of all countries that are able to enforce sanctions on the North.
We've been doing our part to try to maintain pressure on Pyongyang through the enforcement of sanctions so that they will come to the table with a particular mindset where they want to be productive, where they want to reach solutions with us.
He also noted how China has shown some slippage in its enforcement of sanctions.
And what we're seeing from China right now, unfortunately, is some slippage in the enforcement of the sanctions, particularly when it comes to ship-to-ship transfers happening in their territorial waters.
He said the Chinese shoulder a lot of responsibility when it comes to North Korea evading sanctions, despite publicly backing the most recent UN sanctions on the regime. Shriver added that China should admit to the fact that it has been an important partner to North Korea in helping Pyongyang build modern infrastructure. He stressed that Beijing can do much better in pressuring Pyongyang to bring the regime back to the negotiating table. Regarding the working-level talks in Sweden earlier this month, he said that it was an attempt to rebuild diplomacy in the Korean peninsula. Ji-young, Arirang News.
The former commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Vincent Brooks, said Tuesday that the South Korean government faces a big dilemma in maintaining a balance between pursuing a self-reliant defense posture and increasing cooperation with its ally, the U.S. He was speaking at a seminar in Seoul hosted by the Association of the Republic of Korea Army. He said although the process of transferring wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul is in motion, South Korea should not neglect the values associated with the alliance. Brooks said the U.S. forces stationed in the region are being scaled down, but they're also being improved through specialization. In the hope of boosting South Korea's slowing economic growth and domestic consumption, the country's central bank has decided, as expected, to lower its key rate by a 1/4 percentage point. Our Kim Hae-sung has the details.
The Bank of Korea on Wednesday cut its benchmark interest rate to 1.25%. That's the same as its all-time low rate, which was seen between June 2016 and November 2017. The central bank began its easing cycle in July when it slashed the key rate for the first time in 3 years and held rates frozen in August, citing growing uncertainties over the ongoing U.S.-China trade dispute and sluggish domestic economy. Exports in September plunged near 12% on-year, making it the 10th consecutive month of contraction due to weak global demand and falling chip exports. Inflation is also way below the central bank's 2% target. South Korea's inflation fell 0.4% in September, the first time there has been an annual drop in consumer prices since data releases began in 1965. It has raised concerns that Korea may enter a prolonged period of deflation, although government officials downplay the risk, saying the negative figure was a blip due to higher than usual food prices last year. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
And the employment figures for September are out. The good news is they show a brighter picture for job seekers for the second month in a row. Hong Yu with the details.
For 2 consecutive months, the number of newly added jobs in South Korea is above 300,000. The employment rate last month was the highest for the month of September in 23 years, and the unemployment rate was the lowest for the month in 5 years. According to Statistics Korea, the number of employed was more than 27.4 million, with 348,000 new jobs added on year. By age group, those in their 20s, 50s, and 60s saw job creation go up, but those in their 30s and 40s still saw job creation fall. Looking at employment by industry, jobs in health and social welfare services grew the most with 170,000 new jobs. But the manufacturing sector continued to see job creation fall for the 18th consecutive month, down 111,000 on year.
The fall in manufacturing jobs can be seen as the reason why the number of employed people in their 30s and 40s fell. And the increase in employment for people in their 60s was due to the government's fiscal expenditure on creating short-term jobs.
The unemployment rate was the lowest in 5 years for the month of September, with 3.1%. That is a 0.5 percentage point drop on year. At a macroeconomic finance meeting on Wednesday, the first Vice Finance Minister, Kim Yong-bum, said that there has been an improvement in both the quantity and quality of employment, but uncertainties in the internal and external environment remain. Employees more than 65 years old increased remarkably to 231,000, but so has the elderly population. Kim pointed out that as structural factors such as population growth continue to slow down, internal and external conditions surrounding our economy are tough. The government plans to make efforts to implement policies aimed at boosting economic vitality, while steadily pushing for measures to improve the quality of the economy and structural reforms to counter mid to long-term risks. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
It's time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that, I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang JunSok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Dr. Yang, thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here.
So the Bank of Korea cutting its policy rate by a quarter percentage point today to try and give the economy a boost. What was their thinking, and what does this mean?
Okay, well, I think they are very concerned that the growth rate for Korea is declining. Korea's government had, in their outlook, estimated that Korea would grow by 2.4 to 2.5% this year. The Bank of Korea had estimated this year's growth rate to be 2.2%, but now those type of growth rates seem to be impossible. The latest estimate of Korea's growth rate came in by IMF just this week, and that only estimated 2.0%. And personally, I think even 2.0% may be difficult. Given the growth that we already had at the early half of the year, the first half of the year, we would have to do as good as we did last year to reach 2.0%, but right now it looks like things are going to be worse than last year. So even the IMF's pessimistic estimate is probably not going to be met. And then there's also a lot of concern about deflation, as mentioned in the previous story. I personally don't think deflation is that big a problem. I agree with the government interpretation that this is a technical fault because we had a very high food prices last year, but there's no getting around the fact that the inflation, core inflation, if you take out the fresh food and energy, is still very low. It's only about 0.5%, whereas the Bank of Korea's target is 2%. And that signals that there's very weak demand currently, whether it be domestic consumption demand, investment demand, or export demand. So given such low levels of demand, economic recovery is not likely to come out soon. So Bank of Korea has decided that, well, they better lower the rates to try to raise demand. I'm not quite sure how successful it will be, but I feel that Bank of Korea had to try to do something.
Well, the rate cut would seem to have had some effect on the markets. The Kospi up today. What's happening in global stocks, and what's your outlook?
Okay, well, the Korea was obviously affected by the rate cut, but not as much as probably some people had hoped, largely because everybody expected this interest rate cut. Now, as for the global markets, things had gone fairly well at the end of last week because, well, President Trump announced that U.S. and China had a deal worked out. But over the weekend, that came into some bit of a question. The deal does not seem to be as large as President Trump advertised. And China is saying that unless U.S. gives up more tariffs, it's not going to sign the deal, even the small deal that they had agreed to make. So the international market, I think, has become a lot more shaky in the last couple of days. So the international environment, international stock market is really a bit shaky at this point.
Well, now, as we just heard, we've got employment numbers out today in Korea. The newly employed up more than 300,000. The employment rate fell to a 6-year low of 3.1%. On the surface, it would seem things are getting better, but what do you think?
Okay, well, it's good news. I wouldn't say it's great news if you look behind the scenes, but still, it's a lot better than what we were doing at the first half of the year, when we were not only losing jobs, but whatever jobs that were being created were only part-time jobs. Now, this month and last month, we've seen a lot of growth in full-time jobs rather than part-time jobs. So that's good news. And we've seen substantial job growth in the 20-year-olds and over 60-year-olds. However, we have seen some job losses in 30s and 40s, and if you look at a longer period of time, the job creation for people in their 50s are not doing very well either. So that's worrying, since if you don't have a steady job, it'll take longer for consumption demand to pick up. And these 30, 40, 50-year-olds are basically heads of households. So any problems that they have with their jobs and their earning power, it's going to show up a lot, not only in the consumption figures, but also in the welfare figures, because, being head of households, it's not only going to be themselves who are being affected, but also their families. Now, also, the type of jobs that are being created, it seems that we are getting growth in jobs in lodging and restaurants. That's probably because of the Chuseok holidays and people who decided to spend their Chuseok vacation in Korea rather than going to Japan. So that's good news. We'll have to see whether it lasts, because lodging and restaurants, the jobs there took a lot of negative hit over the year and last year because of the higher minimum wage and 52-hour workweek laws. Now, the job gains took place also in social work and health. That's mostly government-funded jobs, so that's where the government fiscal policy comes in, which is okay. But still, we had job loss in the manufacturing sector. We had jobs losses in retail sector, and those can be bad news unless they pick up in the next month or two.
Yeah, it sounds like the big question is whether it lasts. All right, Dr. Yang, that's where we'll leave it today. Thank you for coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Now, the IMF has again cut its forecast for global growth this year, the world economy to grow just 3%, it says, in large part because of trade tensions. South Korea's economy a lowly 2%. Imin Sun reports.
The IMF has downgraded its 2019 global economic growth outlook amid the worsening economic slowdown. In its World Economic Outlook report released on Tuesday, the IMF forecasts the global economy will grow 3% this year, down from its previous forecast of 3.3% that was made in April. It's the IMF's lowest projection since the 2008 global financial crisis. The report says the latest adjustments were made due to the risk factors such as trade tensions, geopolitical tensions like Brexit, and worsening financial sentiment. The IMF's chief economist called on policymakers to take actions to counter risk to growth and to boost economic activity.
To rejuvenate growth, policymakers must undo the trade barriers put in place with durable agreements, rein in geopolitical tensions, and reduce domestic policy uncertainty. Such actions can help boost confidence and reinvigorate investment, manufacturing, and global trade.
Global economic growth for next year was also lowered to 3.4%. Next year's growth is expected to rise from this year's forecast, driven by positive recovery signs from emerging economies like Brazil, Mexico, and Russia. The IMF's economic growth outlook for South Korea in 2019 was also significantly downgraded to 2% from the previous 2.6%.
Internally increasing labour costs are burdening the economy, and external economic conditions are also deteriorating. These have brought down the overall economic growth rate. So far, the Korean economy has achieved economic growth rates of around 3%, but the actual economic crisis seems to be progressing, and growth rates could collapse below the 2% level.
South Korea was one key Asian economy to face a large downgrade adjustment due to the ripple effect of China's economic slowdown and Beijing's trade conflict with the U.S. The IMF also said tougher trade regulations between South Korea and Japan have strengthened uncertainty in trade policy and barriers, and warned of negative impacts on both countries and the region's supply chain. 이민선, 아리랑 뉴스.
South Korea's export prices fell in September from the month before as the won gained ground against the greenback. According to the Bank of Korea, the export price index for last month fell by 0.8%. It was led by a decline in tech exports as the Korean won strengthened against the dollar. On year, the figure for September was down 5%. South Korea and Japan held working-level diplomatic talks in Seoul this afternoon. South Korea's Director General for Asian and Pacific Affairs, Kim Jong-han, met his Japanese counterpart, Shigeki Takizaki, at Seoul's Foreign Ministry. They discussed Tokyo's export curbs and Seoul's subsequent decision to terminate a military intel sharing pact. The meeting comes a week before South Korean Prime Minister Lee Na-kyun's scheduled visit to Japan to attend Emperor Naruhito's enthronement ceremony. The two officials last met in Tokyo a month ago. Moodys Analytics predicts that U.S. President Donald Trump's chances of another 4 years in the White House all depend on the U.S. economy. And for now, the American economy seems to be doing rather well. Our Kim Da-mi has the details.
President Trump is on his way to an easy re-election next year if the U.S. economy holds up. This is according to Moodys Analytics and its 3 economic models released on Tuesday. The agency based its projections on how consumers feel about their own financial situation, stock market gains during Trump's tenure, and their prospects for employment. According to the models, Trump will win at least 289 electoral votes and possibly as many as 351, assuming an average turnout. Moody's Analytics model not only reflects political dynamics but also places a lot of importance on economic factors. The earnings season is off to a great start. Of the 11 S&P 500 companies that reported earnings before the bell on Tuesday, only Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo missed Wall Street's estimates. Blowing analyst expectations, JP Morgan Chase shares surged as much as 4%, and United Health shares jumped 8%. Moody's analysis has been correct in previous elections except in 2016 when it predicted Hillary Clinton would win. But global uncertainties like the U.S.-China trade war are still lingering. U.S. market researcher FX set earlier forecast earnings for the S&P 500 to decline by 4.6% for the third quarter. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
A special train began a journey from Seoul Station this morning, symbolizing a new era of bilateral partnership between South Korea and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The ASEAN Korea train is carrying some 200 high-ranking officials, journalists, and students from Korea and the ASEAN member countries. The top presidential official speaking today looked to the future as Korea and ASEAN celebrate 30 years of friendly ties.
The launch of ASEAN-Korean trade today will begin the journey of our next 30 years together. Like a train in motion, our partnership will be full of energy and forward-looking.
It's now 40 days till the special South Korea-ASEAN Special Summit, the largest international gathering under the current Moon administration. The train will go to the southern port city of Busan, the summit's host city. It'll also stop in Gyeongju, Suncheon, and Gwangju before returning to Seoul on Friday. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.